Hey folks, my name is Tony Mo, and I'm a newer GM. I've got about a year's worth of weekly sessions under my belt over the last 3 years. Started off with 3.5e, moved on to 5e, started doing my own homebrew. I'm a bit of a forever GM. I've never really played in any tabletop games. I've just been GMing and learning this whole time, and I like to make videos about my experiences and share them here on the interwebs. If you guys caught my video on skill checks, kind of talking about implementing our skill checks better, making them a larger component in our narrative encounter design, that encounter was baked into a recent session of Cyberpunk Red that I've been running for my PCs over the course of the last 3+ months. And because we're kind of at a turning point in the campaign, we just finished up one larger, sort of story beat or plot that the players were following along with. I figured this was a perfect time, alongside of my other discussion pieces, to start doing campaign diaries. I think there's a lot that can be gleaned from these, or at least I hope there is, and it'll very much be long format discussion where I talk about what happened in the session, the things I thought the players were going to do, what they ended up doing, and maybe some of the lessons I learned along the way. It's all great to sit down and talk about mechanics and the way we implement them, but sometimes we implement them and they don't work exactly like we thought we would, and we learn from that. So definitely going to talk about both the narrative and combat portion of last week's session, and I'm going to try and make these happen on the weekend. We usually run on Friday, and so I'd like to try and get them out before the weekend is over. This one's going to be a little bit weird, but hopefully as I run our next session tomorrow, I'll be able to put a campaign diary out for you guys, in the following days will be the idea. So you'll be looking at like 2 videos a week from me if all goes as planned. Just doing this for the fun of it, so we'll see where things take us. Well, let's go ahead and jump into our previous session, last week's session. So I actually do all of my tabletop stuff in OneNote. I kind of structure out my own folders depending on the campaign I'm running. I've got one for my Pathfinder campaign that I'm working on. I've got one for my 5e campaign that is currently stagnant. That was a pre-COVID IRL campaign. And as if this isn't real life. And then I got one for my Cyberpunk Red campaign. This beat I called one in, one out. Maybe one out, one in would have been better because a player character was moving on. This player character wasn't killed in combat or anything like that. The player decided to retire them, let them go on to like a tour across the country as a rocker boy. And they were bringing in a new PC that had actually been introduced as an NPC in our campaign about a month and a half prior. The player had made me aware that they were thinking about doing this. And they were kind of just prepping, like, hey, in case anything happens to Bandsaw, knowing the way that they played their character, I think was a big part of this. I have another PC ready. Maybe you could put them in the story as an NPC. And I ended up really going a long way with that, to the point where when the time came and the previous session, the big job came to an end, Bandsaw goes his separate ways. The players then actually have to go and rescue my buddy Trevor's new PC, because he was actually a part of the narrative. This NPC Link, she was a part of the narrative and had actually been trapped out in the Badlands in a canyon when her Aerodyne was shot down while trying to support the team for this big train job that they were on. So the players, kind of to lay out the general plot here, the players going to rescue this PC. She's lost somewhere out in the canyon. They have a rough idea of where she is because of the NPC that she's currently working for, and they're going to go out there and see what they can do. I end up having them do like some tracking rolls. They compete with a corpo hit squad that is actually attempting to kill or to, apprehend, they don't really know exactly, this new player character, Lynx, who is stranded on their own. I talked a lot about this design in my skill checks video, so I don't want to go too heavily into it. If you want to understand how I designed this narrative encounter, check that video out. I'll have it linked down in the description as well as in the pinned comment. Give that a watch if you're interested in how I implement my skill checks and why I did the things I did in this particular encounter. But they were making opposed rolls with this Corpo Hit Squad. The players actually are able to identify it's a Corpo Hit Squad. They roll some really great perception. They also end up rolling stealth really well. The interesting thing here was when I was designing this encounter, I had stealth kind of baked in for the Corpo Hit Squad, right? The idea that I was going to have them try and conceal themselves from the players. And before I even had a chance, the players, are like, can we roll stealth? And It seemed like such an obvious thing when they said it, but for some reason, I guess I just never expected them to. They aren't really stealthy individuals as a group. I've just grown accustomed to them being like, total, just full balls to the wall 24/7. So when they were like, one of them was like, hey, can we roll stealth to hide from this Aerodyne while we're tracking links? Yeah, sure. And one of them rolls like really well, basically crits. And I'm like, okay, you sort of tackle the team as the Aerodyne, as you guys start to identify the Aerodyne into the side of the canyon and say, hey, let's go on foot. Let's stealth through the rest of the way. And so that was kind of really the only out of the ordinary thing in that situation. I will say that I maybe expected them to get a little bit more wild with how they actually went out into the canyons. They just kind of took the car, drove out there, went on foot, which was totally fine. But I guess I was expecting them to maybe like call in like a nomad friend to use a gyrocopter, and they just kind of went straight for it, which obviously nothing wrong with that. It was also a situation where they literally just come off this job. They didn't even get any sort of arrest. They literally come off the job and they get the news that they need to go help, they rescue this PC. So it wasn't as if narratively they had a lot of time, I guess, either to the thing. So maybe they felt, or the way in which I narrated things, they felt like it was very urgent. I think they also, without really knowing that this was exactly Trevor's character, because we had kind of kept it hush-hush that this NPC was actually a character he made. I think deep down they were like, we want to progress forward so, Trevor can get back in the game with us. And so they kind of just went in, and obviously that was totally fine. They get on the car, they end up going in foot. They end up getting a bunch of advantages for the combat encounter because they were able to stay concealed from this Corpo hit squad while they were tracking the same characters they were. Plus they won on their tracking rolls. They were able to win those opposed rolls, and so they made it there first. And so I give them a bunch of advantages as we set up on combat. They have like time to actually set up. I give them a chunk of the canyon. I'll have the battle map on screen for you guys too as we move into the combat discussion here. I let them position themselves like anywhere in this area, and then I explain to them, the mechanic that I designed for Adam Smasher as a part of this combat encounter, which I'm going to go into more depth on as part of a larger discussion for like part 2 of being a GM. So keep an eye out for that video sometime in the coming week, probably later this week, Thursday, Friday-ish, around there. But I kind of explain the combat encounter to them, and, we roll in the NPCs, and I give them an entire first round of like the element of surprise. Cyberpunk doesn't have a mechanic for this necessarily baked in, but what I like to do when the players like stealth into a combat or able to set up in a concealed fashion is if I have a group coming in, I'm going to roll initiative because I want to have like a round-based thing happening here, obviously. So like things aren't happening in real time anymore, as I say, okay, well, you guys for the entire initiative order will skip all the bad guys. We've rolled their initiative, that's great, but you guys are all just going to go on your initiative and we're going to skip them because they're not engaged in the combat yet. You have this this element of surprise, you have this ambush, this stealth advantage. And so that's what I did. We skipped through a bunch of them in combat, and then as we get into the second round, everything goes to normal initiative order, and they start slinging some lead. So let's talk a little bit more about this encounter, the things I designed when I built this battle map, and the things the players did and didn't do. So one of the big things about this battle map was I wanted to have sort of these raised points on the map that would be kind of exposed with minimal cover. That then had like these, sort of old rickety wooden bridges connecting them. I really wanted to make this feel like it was a scavers like kind of paradise where scavers, like desert scavers, nomad scavers, go on their dirt bikes and just rip around, right? And they got like these trails they're bumming through and stuff. And so I wanted that like verticality in the combat. Give the players opportunities to make some climbing attempts. A couple of them have grappling guns that they even used, and so that was pretty interesting. I think all in all, I was pretty happy with the way that the battle map came out and the way they ended up using it. There are definitely some changes I would have made. I probably would have moved those wooden bridges to maybe encourage, maybe encourage the players actually using them a little bit more. Or make it so using the bridges gave them some sort of a movement advantage. That was kind of a last minute element. And I guess in my head when I put them on there, I was like, hey, maybe if some bad guys go up here, the players might get creative and like try and shoot the bridge to collapse it. That could be cool because I was like, these bridges are like at least 20 meters up. None of that ended up really happening. It's also the first time that I've given them a map, I think, of that depth. I typically just make like blueprint style, like classic CP Cyberpunk maps, because there's not a lot of great resources for like building your own custom like urban style maps for Cyberpunk, unless you like hand draw everything yourself or get like a bunch of assets from like 2 Minute Tabletop. And it's just so much to do in urban setting that I prefer to let the players like theater of mind these environments and just give them these blueprint style layouts. But since this was in the canyons, I was like, yeah, I'll use Dungeon Draft for this, and whip this up and kind of make this a special moment since they were rescuing this PC. And I think it worked out pretty well. As a whole, I just wanted to create an environment where there was a decent amount of cover so they could do some flanking. And so more importantly, honestly, in this case, the NPCs could do some flanking, since the primary objective for this group of NPCs, this Corpo Hit Squad, is to hunt down and, capture or just eliminate this new player character, Lynx. I wanted this moment of like tension and fear, right? As this new character enters the crew, there's also a possibility for them to slip between, to lose their life right then and there. And this was a very, very lethal encounter. It was designed to be lethal. I threw a lot of very powerful units at them. Every single one of the Corpo Hit Squads was it was an identical like soldier that I built, right, with a very high dexterity. Just the idea that they would be like very well trained, super lethal group of individuals. These aren't just some like cops from NC. These are like super well paid professionals. And so they've got serious kit. They've got rifles and shotguns with incendiary ammunition in them. They've got, melee weapons. They've got like the full gambit. They can fight in pretty much any range. And the players learned that pretty quickly. There were a couple instances where they kind of got in close, and I had these guys switch to shotguns at one point and start pumping incendiary rounds into the players, which made for some bad days for a couple of them. And then the swords, obviously, to try and make some very close attacks. The thing I really liked about giving them swords, giving them a melee weapon, honestly, I strongly recommend this. You didn't even have to have these characters be very skilled in melee or brawling, but giving them a melee weapon, number one, I just think narratively from a thematic perspective is really nice when a player is getting chased down by this target who is just shooting them with a rifle, and now this guy pulls out a sword or a melee weapon of some sort and starts trying to hit them with it. It also allows the player to really players to really mix up the way they're dealing with a threat. So instead of this threat just, maybe trying to kite them to keep in that perfect DV range in Cyberpunk Red, the player can use evasion when they get up close to dodge. And this happened with Lynx. So this new player character played by my buddy Trevor, it's very low body character, very low HP, super high dexterity, a ton of cyberware, pushing towards the very low spectrum of the empathy scale. That's kind of where he wanted this character to start off. And so he goes all in and then starts getting swings taken at him. And it's a good moment for him as a player because he built a high dexterity character, for reasons. He wanted this character to be able to dodge shots and melee attacks. And so he gets surrounded, and then rather than having to sort of panic, be like, man, I'm just going to take raw damage here, he gets to start doing all these evasion rolls, and he is able to dodge his way out of a pretty nasty situation. And there's sort of a climax for his character that is reached about, 2 hours into this combat session, where towards the end of this combat session, I'll have a picture of the actual roll for you guys, because we did save it because it was unbelievable, where his character at this point has essentially dodged death twice at this point. All right, he overextends himself, takes a ton of damage. Lynx is super weak at this point. She's down to 10 HP or something like that. She could be one shot at any point in time. Also, keeping in mind that not only do these guys are firing 5d6 damage rifles, I've got snipers positioned up that are, they could potentially do some insane damage if they can roll high enough. Their DV in this battle map is pretty difficult. Almost every target, even at max range, is pushing 20 to 25 DV. Very hard shots to hit. I was totally fine with that because I wanted them to struggle in this environment. So when they did hit, it was an extreme moment where the players were like, oh, fuck, And so something like that kind of happens. He eats a sniper shot, actually. He had been given a combat stim that let him negate damage for an entire turn by another NPC. It was a thing I homebrewed because I knew exactly how he was going to play this character. And I was like, I'm going to give him one get out of jail free card. And it was like almost a last minute decision for me as a GM to like whip up this item. And I was like, he's going to be wounded because he rolled damage for falling out of the Aerodyne, which is how he ended up in the canyons. He ends up starting off with like already like 10 points of HP gone and like 2 ablation on his armor. And so I'm like, I'm going to have the NPC who he works for currently, which is good Atom Smasher. There are 2 Atom Smashers in my story. Yes, it's a lot to explain. Don't worry. This is the good Atom Smasher, quote unquote. He gives Link's this combat stim. So she's got this combat stim now, and I'm like, that will negate all damage that your character takes for an entire round. And I've been going pretty heavy on the nanotech narrative in my campaign. Again, it is using the Cyberpunk Red setting, but I've twisted it a lot. Nanotechnology is something that has been much further developed by Arasaka, and the players have actually been able to dig into some of this history that Arasaka has left behind in the Hot Zone. And they've gotten their hands on some pretty fucking cool nanotechnology. And so this was kind of like another example of nanotech in the forms of this insane combat cocktail that like allows the player's skin to like harden to the point where bullets just, like supernatural levels of ricochet off. Listen, I don't have many boundaries when it comes to my Cyberpunk campaign. I fucking go wild, all right? So he pops this, Lynx pops this, eats a sniper round, falls back. 3 rounds later, this happens. He is already very weak. I think at this point, still 10 HP or whatever. And I'm like, this corporal soldier like sees you. I mean, he's right. He's gonna shoot you. So this dude rolls. He preems. This dude crits. And ends up with a 20 to hit on an AR with armor piercing ammunition. I roll damage. It's a 5d6 damage roll. All right. This dude preems on 3 of his dice. So we've got 3 6s, 3 crits, and a 5 and a 4 for 32 points of damage. 32 points of damage. Even if his character had full armor and it wasn't ablated, his character's HP is so low because of their body stat, and he's only running like it's like 12 armor in terms of the armor value. That would have one-shotted his character, regardless. And so I'm like, yeah, he's down, like you're going to lose your brand new character first round. Like they like a lethal game. They've been enjoying a more lethal game. And so I've been sticking to my guns on it. They knew what to expect. He rolls for evasion and gets a fucking 21, 1 point over the hit. Fortunately, like his dex is so high that he doesn't even need to crit, but he rolls a 9 still, which is really impressive. And beats out this corporal soldier's AR hit attack by 1 roll, and that saves his character. From that point on, Lynx takes like no damage for like the next like 5 rounds, and everyone else around them just starts dying. So they had several NPCs helping them at this point. Atom Smasher again had like a whole mechanic set up where he was firing using a shoulder arms check on a round-around basis. He could engage the targets with 2 rate of fire on every turn. If he beat that DV, which was all the way up to 20 because of some things that happened with one of the NPCs, and then they start focus firing him. Like eventually it's like, yeah, Smasher's up on this ridge, no cover, just firing on our guys. Smasher ends up going down eventually. Then they had called in one of the other NPCs they're working with, who is Morgan Blackhand. There's a smorgasbord of NPCs from the Cyberpunk universe in my campaign, if you haven't noticed. They're all living very different lives. He shows up with the car. He was like back up at the edge of the canyon. He gets to them after, basically they call him. I'm like, he'll show up in 2 rounds. That's the time it's going to take him to get here. I was pretty generous about that. He shows up, gets in, gets the car in, starts trying to help them, gets his leg blown off by a crit shot from a sniper, and has 1 movement. And at this point, it's all the players are just scrambling, trying to drag people to the car so they can just get out of there. I think they were down to like, it was 2 soldiers and the 2 snipers were still alive. So they weren't even like trying to clear the combat field anymore. They realized like, man, we just barely survived this. Yeah, we killed a ton of people. They killed like the captain of the hit squad. We got Lynx. We just need to get out of here. And this entire time, as we're like rolling into these last few rounds, one of the players was having like a 3-round standoff with one of the soldiers, right on top of one of those raised platforms that I was talking about, the raised like sort of dirt cliffs, and is just like rolling absolutely trash, just ones after twos, missing all of their shots with their SMG. And then this dude just starts wailing on them with incendiary rounds. So they get lit on fire, and you've got to roll. You basically got to make some sort of a skill check, and as the GM, it's like, you tell me what skill you would use and how you would put this fire out. It could be as simple as like, a basic survival check, which his character, the character who was on fire, is a nomad. Actually, I believe has pretty good survival, so he ended up using that. But he just rolled so bad. Literally 3 rounds in a row, I think it was. He rolled a 1. Just rolled a 1, which... fortunately in Cyberpunk, when you roll a crit, or a critical failure, 1 or a 10 on your 1d10, you roll another of that dice, and then you add that to that. So he was getting like 3s. He'd roll a 1, and then you'd roll another 1, and you get like 2. You get like 3s, just whiffing it terribly. And so he was just on fire for 3 rounds, taking 2 damage from this fire, straight to body every single round. It's no armor ablation here. You're burning. You're on fire from these incendiary rounds, and was down to like 7 HP. One of the players then, one of the other players, their tech kick goes down just from raw damage because they're getting ambushed by the last remaining squad. Fortunately, as Blackhand shows up before his leg gets destroyed, I'm like, if Blackhand's going to show up, I'm going to have him use like his full tool set. And Blackhand is like very capable solo. He's got smoke grenades. He starts throwing smoke grenades out to provide concealment for the players, which is a -4 to all hit rolls for anybody in the smoke, shooting through the smoke. And that pretty much like saves their life. They all laughed like, here's the plot armor. I was like, you called Blackhand in. He didn't have to show up. But when he showed up, I was going to play him smart and try and actually help you guys out. That should be my job as the GM at this point. That's your comrade. He comes in. He's like throwing smokes and blasting with his revolver. And they all just barely make it out alive. They do actually start getting chased by a second Aerodyne. There was another team of reinforcements that was actually being rolled in the background of this entire combat encounter. Basically trying to track the players as well. The idea that somebody called for backup, but these caverns, these canyons they're in are so just twisty and windy, and the weather was providing them a lot of overhead concealment. Because we had rolled for weather that day, and it was just like extreme reduced visibility on the sky. And so I was rolling to see if this thing was going to show up, and they were going to have to deal with reinforcements. And they showed up on like the last round. I think they finally rolled, and I was like, man, these guys suck. But they show up, and so I'm like, okay, well, as you guys try to leave, we go, sort of back to theater of mind narrative. They're basically trying to rip their way out of the canyon, and so it's up to the Nomad again. He's in the back seat, actually, all right, because the other player, their fixer, was the one who managed to get to the car, because everybody else is like downed or at one movement. They stabilize everybody. They drag them into the car. The Nomad, who's got 6 HP, who's been on fire, is in the back seat, plugs his interface plugs in, and is driving, like bleeding over the back seat. He managed to make a bunch of great land driving vehicle skill checks. And basically loses the Aerodyne that was chasing them in the canyon, in the the dense fog. They get back into Night City, and they're able to make it to their clinic in South Night City, where they have like a contact there who basically fixes them all up. They just barely squeak out of this one. It was probably one of the most exciting combat encounters I've had in Red. Honestly, apart from the one that they just did before this, which was this huge train heist that I was very excited to design and mess around with. I did some new stuff in it for the first time. And I learned a lot. So, mistakes, or I guess, lessons, things that I would have done differently now that we've kind of blasted our way through everything that happened with the players. I think first and foremost, I've been so focused on like mechanical side of things, the technical side of things, and designing encounters. And I've been trying to boost my narrative, encounter stuff, the narrative play side of the game, heavily. I think bringing the narrative into the individual NPCs they're fighting is something that I would really like to focus on. It's not something I do nearly enough, and I was disappointed because I had plans for it, and I just kind of forgot in the heat of the moment. There was the Corpo Hit Squad captain. I had actually given him a name and made him like kind of an NPC. His name was Rex Haller. He's supposed to be this real cocky, like if Adam Jensen was a total turbo douche bad guy, Corpo murderer instead of who Adam Jensen is. Just full on awful person, but like has like an Adam Jensen vibe with the cyber glasses and shit. And I was gonna have him like talking and stuff and making interactions with Lynx to kind of give her an idea of why she was being hunted by this corpo hit squad. And I just didn't. I mean, I was having a great time explaining all of like the failures and the successes, and the snipers just whiffing like the entire time, and then finally hitting a couple good crits and just absolutely wrecking Morgan Blackhand's poor leg. Then I just forgot, and it kills me because it's something I just want to do more of. So it's going to be a big focus of the next combat encounter I design for sure, is like really baking out a couple key characters and just making them shitty, awful people that the players don't like. I want to like have that sort of emotional interaction with the players, and I want them to be like, man, this guy fucking sucks. I was already gonna kill him because he's trying to kill me, but he really fucking sucks. Like let's get this dude. I just wanted to make this character that they were absolutely going to hate. Not that I haven't done that before from like a narrative side of things or characters they really love, but I wanted it to happen in combat. I wanted this character to like develop, so when they finally killed this guy, there'd be like, cheers around the virtual table. They already kind of had that moment because this dude was increasing the skill check difficulty on Smasher shoulder arms for his round-based like machine gun support fire that I had set up. So when they killed him, they were really still happy. But again, it's just something that I want to work on. I want to spend more time with. I haven't really had a chance to. Outside of that, I've been trying to like really think about cover design in Cyberpunk Red as far as my battle maps go, because it's really important. I think honestly, as a GM, if you're making your own combat maps, your own battle maps for Cyberpunk Red, the hardest thing is figuring out how to do cover right. And that's going to sound like silly. You're going to be like, well, just give the players cover. The thing is, because you have a movement system and a cover system in Cyberpunk Red where you can move, shoot, and then move again and go back to cover, and the cover gives you 100% concealment. Cover is pure line of sight based in Cyberpunk Red. There's no like 10%, 20%, 50%, 100% cover. If you're in cover and the opponent can't see you and vice versa, they can't shoot you. What they can do is they can shoot the cover you're behind and eventually destroy it. In this case, they were in a canyon. There's like huge boulders they were hiding behind. So I wasn't really going to enable cover destruction. Perhaps it's something I should consider even in a setting like this in the future, and make a lot of the cover like loose bits of stone and dirt that could be blown up with grenades. But it's a difficult thing to work with in Cyberpunk. Like, you want to position it in a way where there is like a moment of risk, right? Like if the players are going to flank the enemy or the enemy is going to flank the players, you don't want to just have like perfect cover where they can easily do that. And again, that's a difficult thing because the movement in Cyberpunk Red is pretty meaty. Like you've got characters moving 6 to 7 spaces, and then they can do a dash action and move 14. They can move twice that, which that's a pretty big distance. So unless you're making battle maps that are just obscenely large, which I think I'm actually going to try and do for one of our next combat encounters, it's difficult. And also, battle maps don't really make that much sense in Cyberpunk Red. It's a lot of like tight urban stuff. This was probably one of the few instances out in the canyons here where I really probably could have went nuts and put some massive ranges on things and let like people with sniper rifles go wild. It's just something that I'm still getting into. Well, I don't think the players really notice it that much. I do, when I'm like, oh, they're just going to stop and pop these guys this entire time. And then, so it's like, oh, I have the NPCs rush up and then try and force them out. And that's where I've been using grenades actually more now on my NPCs. Pretty much all of the NPCs and like stat blocks I've built for these NPCs now have stun grenades, tear gas grenades. I used incendiary grenades in this combat to try and really fuck the players up. Even the previous combat that we did, used a tear gas grenade. A couple of the players got affected by it. So, like, cover is important. You got to make it. It's a cover-based, like combat system for sure. I don't like the idea of players just stuck out in the open, just shooting back and forth like a comedy. But there's just some considerations to be made. And there is a whole mechanic for like the destruction of cover. Different materials can be destroyed pretty easily in Cyberpunk Red. They have health values like in the book for them. So I think just looking at that and really clarifying to the players like in advance as combat opens up, like, hey, by the way, that's cover, but that's made out of this. And trying to integrate that into the combat so we can, expand on the tactical nature of Cyberpunk Red's combat a little bit more. I'm already trying to do that by giving, the combat encounters a little bit more life, creating these like round-based events that happen, like Smasher support fire for the team. With the train, they were getting like a flyby from an Aerodyne that was shooting them, and they had to roll for evasion to try and dodge out of its gunfire. So that was fun. So I think just further expanding those sort of systems and the way I implement them, and then looking at cover while I'm doing it and being like, okay, what can we do with cover that's going to make this more interesting? I do think when you have like a realistic environment you're trying to make for your battle map, it kind of helps because the cover comes naturally. Like parked cars and like a city street and stuff like that. But even then, you should be asking yourself, like, where are the solid pieces of cover? Is there like a concrete barrier here that pretty much is indestructible, right, for the players to use to like make a big flank? How quickly could this cover get destroyed? It's just something that, if you're going to start using destructible cover and tell the players like this can be destroyed, then you've got to stay consistent. You've got to do that throughout the rest of your combat encounters because they're going to expect it. And so if you're not careful with how you place it, suddenly things could start going very, very wrong. And either all of your NPCs get wiped because they have no more cover because the players destroyed it in one round, or vice versa, or both. It's just something to consider. So that's kind of where my mind went as I wrapped up that combat and was like, that went really well, I think. But here's something to consider for the future. And so I think we'll go ahead and end that session diary, that campaign diary, if you will, campaign journal, right there. We're gonna just, like I said, call that session 1, as we are kind of moving into a new narrative plot. This week, which is actually tomorrow, the next session, the players are going to be diving into a bit of a mystery. We've got 2 characters now that have like pretty expansive detective-focused skill sets. The Fixer was already there. And now this new character, the new PC Lynx, who actually has a contract with Danger Girl, which is like, the detective agency in NC right now, has got a thing going on. And I'm tying their plots together as they try to figure out why a Militech hit squad was hunting down Lynx. And then there's a whole backstory going on with my buddy's character, The Business, who is their Fixer, who has gotten this sort of blast from the past. This is a player who's written a backstory for their character, and I've been pulling it apart and using it over time. And now we've kind of hit a big plot point of like, hey, that Netrunner that died, kind of because of what happened with you while you were working with them, they have a twin sister, and their twin sister like meets up with you and they want revenge. They want to hunt down the person that did this to their sister. And in turn, also ruined your life as a Fixer at that point in time. And so they're like diving deep into the corpo depths. And while that's happening, I'm going to be introducing an entirely new faction that is kind of working in the shadows of NC. And so I'm really excited to see where they go with this. We'll talk more about that in the next campaign diary. Thank you so much for hanging out. If you didn't check out my first Being a GM video, where we really dove into the implementation of skill checks in our narrative encounter design, just better implementing them, making sure they give the players a serious sense of like consequence, and ways in which we can use them to just bump up the tension and breathe a little bit of life into our narrative encounters. Strongly recommend you watch it. Link down in the description as well as the pinned comment. That's it. Thanks for watching. Take care of yourselves out there. Be awesome to one another. I'll see you around.